Hey internets, so there was a recent very tragic event that unfortunately has managed to get a little bit over politicized. And in this video I'm just going to try and set the record straight on what most likely happened and who's most likely to blame. And whether or not it's more likely to be DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, or the problem is more likely to be Trump defunding the FAA recently. But first off, for those of you who aren't keyed in, here's what happened. Basically, a passenger airplane crashed into a military Black Hawk helicopter and everybody involved died. It was a mid-air explosion, so everybody either died immediately from the impact or died from injuries resulting from the fall. So, very unfortunate event. Current knowledge says that all 67 people involved in the crash are presumed to be dead. Everyone found so far has just been remains of the deceased. No survivors, as of me recording this, have been discovered. The crash happened at Reagan National Airport out of Washington, D.C., and it happened again as recording of this video very recently at 2 o'clock GMT on Wednesday, so just this January 29th. And the people who lost their lives includes a young officer who was recently engaged, along with, strangely enough, a whole bunch of figure skating champions and professionals. But regardless, it's obviously a tragedy. It's not good that it's happened, and nobody should be celebrating the event. But again, the purpose of this video is to set the record straight on the politicization of this event, because people who are familiar with my channel know that I don't usually cover recent events. I just refute stupid stuff from a lib-right perspective. But yeah, the politicization of this event is really just the blame game. Donald Trump blamed DEI, and a bunch of lefties blamed Donald Trump for his recent defunding of the FAA. And all of this is kind of stemming from a few problems. The first is that the far left, again, continues to not understand what DEI is and why it's a problem. Because a lot of people on the far left continue to strawman DEI as some kind of attack against black people, which is absolutely not the case. That's not what DEI is. That's not the problem with DEI. That's not the criticism of DEI that conservatives actually have. You see this strawman from people like Nina Turner, was 2020 attacks on BLM, 2022 attacks on CRT, 2024 attacks on woke, 2025 attacks on DEI. Black, they mean black. Basically, Turner is accusing people who talk about DEI of just not liking black people or wanting to remove black people. That is 100% not true at all. First off, diversity, equity, and inclusion could apply to any ethnicity, including in some cases white people, so there's no reason to believe it's uniquely a criticism against African Americans. That is, again, 100% not a thing. The problem with diversity, equity, inclusion policies is that they, in practice, necessarily require an organization to hire and promote based on factors that are other than competency. The far left, of course, says that this is in favor of equality, and the problem with that is that equality isn't necessarily always a good thing, and everyone kind of knows this. For example, if you have two people giving their opinion on how rocket science works, and one is a rocket scientist, and the other is a homeless bum who just got done smoking a crack pipe, everybody understands that the rocket scientist probably has a better idea of what he's talking about. There are rare cases where the bum might be right, but if you're a betting man, you'll probably put bets on the rocket scientist. The point here is equality isn't really something that people actually believe in. Everybody knows that perfect equality isn't a real thing, and this has been the criticism of DEI. DEI claims to create opportunities for underrepresented, disenfranchised minorities, but in practice, all it really does is force companies and force government agencies to hire based on ethnicity instead of competency, because it forces them to take ethnicity into consideration alongside competency. And this has a negative effect on the entire organization, even if you're not immediately dealing with someone who is a DEI hire. Because the evidence of this crash so far don't seem to reveal that either pilots or the air traffic control agent involved at the time were DEI hires. But that doesn't necessarily mean that DEI had no impact on this event. And this is because DEI is a very wide-reaching policy measure. It always has a small impact on pretty much everything in any organization where DEI policies are present. For example, let's just think of the operation of a commercial cruise liner ship. A large cruise liner with passengers on board tends to require a crew of around 1,000 people. Now, obviously, these 1,000 people do not perform the same job. The captain of the ship requires a much higher level of competency and understanding of how the cruise ship operates than, say, one of the janitors, and requires a very different skill set as well. For instance, the captain probably knows less about cooking than the chef, and the chef probably understands less about how the ship operates than the captain. And of course, the ship is going to necessarily have a hierarchy. You are going to have certain people calling the shots above others based on the job that they perform. For example, people working in the engine room probably have a head supervisor who has tenure and better understanding of how the engine room is supposed to operate, and the people serving the customers of the cruise liner probably have supervisors above them who've been doing the job much longer. But for simplicity's sake, let's just break it down to a competency score. In a completely meritocratic system of a commercial liner, you can break it down to everybody having a competency score in the aspect of their job, and the people with the highest competency score do the job that they have the competency for. But let's say the commercial liner decides to take DEI policies on board, and shift things around based on DEI measures. Now, in addition to a competency score, everyone is now given a privilege score, which is taken in consideration alongside their competency score. Again, this is oversimplifying the hiring process and the decision process, but logically this is what the process of DEI requires. And what this means is, sure, you might have some underrepresented groups now in greater positions of authority on this cruise liner than they ordinarily would have if the DEI policies didn't exist. The problem is this also creates a competency issue. It means that you now have lower competency scores across the board, and this negatively affects the entire cruise ship. Because say if you have a less competent supervisor in the engine room, that means the captain of the ship is receiving worse information of how the engine room is performing, or less accurate information in comparison to what he would receive if DEI was not a factor here, if we were to just go entirely by competency. And on the flip side, if the captain is a DEI hire, then the supervisor of the engine room will be receiving worse instructions from the captain, which means that everybody in the engine room will also be receiving worse instructions from their supervisor. But it can also have negative effects from the bottom up. For example, let's say the people taking customer orders for food are less competent, which means that the chef is now more likely to receive inaccurate orders on what he is supposed to cook, which increases the chances that the chef will screw up regardless of whether or not the chef is the most competent worker. And this, of course, can then lead to a negative customer experience, which can lead to those customers leaving negative reviews for the cruise liner, which then may reflect negatively on the captain, even if the captain had done everything correctly. And so when you're hiring for measures other than competency as an organization policy, the overall negative effect is actually much worse than most people realize. It negatively hits the whole stack. The customer experience of the cruise liner will be negatively affected as a whole, because the ship is no longer operating at its best efficiency. And that is the problem with DEI. DEI creates inefficiency. When you force an organization to distribute their workload or structure their hierarchy in ways that goes against competency, you necessarily introduce some level of inefficiency. And arguments in favor of DEI are always based on just equality, and they never really focus on this inefficiency problem, or they pretend that it's not a problem. Or again, they just strawman the whole thing and make false accusations of racism, which is ironic, of course, because when you think about it, you realize that DEI itself is actually what's racist. The state requiring private companies to take people's ethnicity into account into the hiring process is a textbook example of ethnic collective guilt, which is what racism effectively is. And so when you see comments like this claiming that being against DEI is some kind of dog whistle against black people, not only is that a straw man argument, it's a very stupid argument. It is the opposite of what is true. If anything, DEI makes things worse for black people, because requiring people to hire based on ethnicity can actually lead to people blaming minorities for random things, regardless of whether or not the minority was actually at fault. So you should actually be against DEI if you're a minority. We would actually see less incentive for people to be racist in this country if we did not have DEI. And that is what I see the far left continuing to grossly misunderstand. But anyways, back on the topic of the DC crash. Is Trump correct when he blamed DEI? And the answer is, well, maybe. It's hard to tell whether or not anybody involved was a direct DEI hire. However, again, DEI as a policy measure affects the whole stack. It affects the entire organization negatively, which means that Donald Trump is actually, at the very least, partially correct, or at least a little bit correct. When something goes wrong in an organization that uses DEI practices, you can pretty much always blame DEI, and you will always be at least 1% correct, because again, it negatively affects the whole stack. But is it meaningful to blame DEI in this particular instance? Is it the most accurate take? Again, maybe, but probably only a little bit, because if we look at the evidence of the crash, or what we've found so far, it appears that the fault mainly lied with the Black Hawk helicopter, because you can't really blame the pilot of the airplane. The craft was apparently a CRJ 700 series bombardier, and this plane does not seem to have the capabilities to quickly evade a helicopter that suddenly appears in its path. It would be a very hard maneuver to do, especially at night, when the tragedy occurred. If you're piloting this aircraft, you effectively need air traffic control to tell you where to go, or else you're kinda screwed in this scenario. So that brings the question then to air traffic control. And this is where the first problem seems to arise. It seems that one air traffic control agent was assigned to do the job that is usually assigned to two people. He was assigned to take care of both helicopters and airplanes. However, the transcript has actually been released. We can listen to the audio of what ATC was telling both the airplane and the helicopter at the time of the crash. And what we find in this recording is that air traffic control did indeed warn the helicopter about what was about to happen, and that the airplane was just following procedure as normal. And so the helicopter was warned that traffic was just south of them, and the Black Hawk helicopter proceeded to crash into the airplane anyways, which suggests mostly an error of pilot skill on the part of the helicopter, since that is is the craft that actually is capable of maneuvering out of the way in this particular scenario. Black Hawk helicopters can practically stop on a dime. There have been a lot of military officials commenting that this is just a thing that shouldn't happen. There's actually even been some conspiracy theories floating around that the crash was intentional, because it's something that can really only happen if the helicopter pilot has a very serious lapse in momentary judgment, or gets distracted right at the moment or something like that. It is very weird because the Black Hawk pilot is heard on the radio apparently responding that they have the traffic in sight, and apparently the pilot even acknowledged seeing the incoming aircraft, and yet about 40 seconds later they crashed into the airplane anyway. So very, very weird, because again, this helicopter has the capability of avoiding this crash with this level of advanced warning. So in other words, again, the conclusion is that this was most likely the result of pilot error on part of the helicopter, based on our current best known information. This is again a fairly recent current event. More information could come out, so I could be wrong on this, but that appears to be the most likely direct cause of the crash. An unfortunate tragic accident caused by a momentary lapse in judgment. Honestly, just like most roadway crashes. Most of the time, traffic accidents are caused by someone just not paying attention. But anyway, leftist politicians are blaming Trump. So for instance, we have AOC here claiming that it's Trump's fault because Trump gutted the Aviation Safety Committee last week, and therefore air traffic was understaffed as a result of Trump's actions. And when I looked into it, this revealed itself to be, surprise, surprise, a very deceptive take. Because when you read AOC's own link that she posted, we immediately see that what the Trump administration actually did was firing the heads of the TSA and the Coast Guard, and eliminating the advisory committee of the Aviation Security Advisory Committee. And as for the impact on the Federal Aviation Administration, it appears that the only thing Trump would have done would just reduce the number of graduates coming out of the controller training programs through the FAA's funding. He didn't actually just completely pull the plug. And what I see a lot of leftists online doing is that they're trying to use the reasoning that because Donald Trump touched the FAA in some way, then this magically means that air traffic control just stopped existing. And that is 100% not a thing. In fact, there was a fairly well-known analysis from Al Jazeera explaining that Trump's firing of TSA and other things he did likely had absolutely nothing to do with this particular crash. And honestly, logically, that makes sense. It's very, very unlikely that a policy change from the head up would have any effect on ATC staffing for that day just a week later. It takes years of training to get a replacement for these jobs. And so what people on the left, like AOC and Destiny, are doing is they're just presuming a causal link to exist here, without really showing any evidence. Which is funny, because these are usually the people who are constantly whining, correlation does not imply causation, and yet here they are committing that very fallacy. And that is why Trump and the Republicans are closer to the truth of this matter than the lefties are. When we look into it, the FAA and TSA, as well as the military and those in charge of air traffic control, the companies and organizations involved have unfortunately been following DEI policies for years, whereas Trump's recent policy change has not really gone into effect long enough to have any kind of impact. It is therefore significantly more likely that DEI had an impact on this tragedy than any recent change from Donald Trump. The best argument I could find coming from the DEI apologist here was that, again, the person in charge of that particular air traffic control position was a position that should be done by two people. But again, the transcript of the event shows that air traffic control actually did do their job. But honestly, I think both parties are wrong in this particular event. If DEI had an impact here, it was probably less of an impact than just a momentary lapse in judgment on the fault of the helicopter pilot. So this appears to be more of a freak tragedy that could potentially occur under any system, no matter how meritocratic it is. Because human beings are, well, just not perfect. It was an unfortunate event, and I wish people would stop politicizing things like this before evidence had even appeared. That's part of the reason I'm making this video. Because right when the tragedy struck, a lot of people on the left and a lot of people on the right immediately jumped on either blaming DEI or blaming Trump's recent policy changes, before we had any evidence whatsoever on who the pilots were or what TSA was doing, or what air traffic control was doing, before we even had the transcript or anything at all. And that's kind of really dumb. You have to at least wait for the basic evidence to come out of who was involved before you start pointing fingers like that. So while Trump and the Republicans are slightly more correct in this particular instance, the whole discourse around this tragedy, from what I have seen, just kinda reeks of stupid. And that's pretty much all I have to say in this video. Thanks for watching. Feel free to like, share, comment, and subscribe, and if you like my content and want to support me, you can do so on either Ko-Fi, Subscribestar, or by buying some merch. Which, again, there is currently a limited time sale on my taxation is theft goods. And since a few people are asking, I'll probably end this sale within a couple weeks or so. So yeah, get it for that price while you can. And the profits do help me out a lot in the continuation of my content. But yeah, again, that is all. Till next time.